Welcome back, and here we go again. When I'm in the classroom, I kind of like to chat with the students for a little bit at the beginning of a class, and I never get a chance to do that. And I miss that. I miss interacting with you. So all I do is lecture. So here I go. I was talking last time about the development of the textile industry, and it became an industry that relied heavily on cotton after the invention of the cotton gin. There probably was still some wool used in the manufacture of textiles, but for the most part in the United States, the textile industry was the cotton industry. And just as a side note, the English textile industry, which I mentioned had been around for a couple of hundred years and was known as the woolens industry, also began to rely heavily on cotton. They started, I don't know that they stopped manufacturing wool, but they just started manufacturing, in addition to wool, they did a lot of cotton textiles. The textile industry was the cotton industry. And this is really important in American history. The textile industry was the largest and first major industry in the United States. And for many years, it dominated our whole industrial setting. There certainly were other industries, there are a lot of other manufacturing establishments around in the United States, but by far the most prominent one was the textile industry. And there's some unusual characteristics about the textile industry because it relied on cotton, and cotton is a plant that requires a long growing season to mature. So you can only grow cotton in the South. There's a line across the country, approximately the line, if you look at a map, between Virginia and North Carolina, between Kentucky and Tennessee, and then across in south of Missouri. You look at a map, and approximately north of that, it's just too short a growing season. Winter's too long, and you can't grow cotton. There's places south of that where you're up in the mountains. If you go down into the southern Alabama or the northern parts of Alabama, that's very mountainous, and in high altitudes you can't grow cotton. But just to simplify, we'll say that cotton is a southern industry, or it's a southern form of agriculture. I have to correct myself. The agriculture, the production of cotton, is a southern crop. It is also a very labor-intensive crop. The plants require frequent tending during the year. You have to regularly go out and plow up the between the rows of cotton plants to keep the weeds out from taking over the cotton. So it requires a lot of maintenance, and harvesting has to be done by hand. So it's a very labor-intensive industry. It's not like northern agriculture, which depended, say, on wheat, where to a much greater extent, all you have to do is, you just throw some seeds out there at the beginning of the season, wait, and then you go out and harvest it at the end of the season. Harvest time is you need a lot of help, but that's only for a week or two of the year that you need a lot of help, so you have to have neighbors and everything else come in and help harvest the wheat crop. It's also a crop that very early on we started developing mechanism. We developed reapers that could cut the wheat with a horse-drawn vehicle, mitigating the need for labor in the harvest. So you still needed a lot of labor, but it didn't have to be harvested by hand as cotton did. So cotton is very labor intensive. And I'm sure you can see where this is going, you know, what the importance of that is, because cotton caused a great increase in the demand for slavery. Slavery, as you remember, had always been much more prevalent in the South than in the North. As colonies, and early in our history, we had slavery in every colony and then in every state, but there were always more in the South, because even before cotton, Southern agriculture with products such as tobacco and sugar was more labor intensive. Now cotton came along, and it's the most labor intensive agricultural product of all. So cotton growing was limited to the South by natural factors, by the nature of the plant, and that created a great increase in the demand for slavery in the South. And this is going to change this whole look of slavery in America. As I said, it had always been more prevalent in the South. But early in our history, even in the South, there were many people who were upset about slavery and felt that it should be eventually eliminated. Nobody knew how, nobody knew when, and as I told you, they don't know how to deal with the issue of what to do with the slaves after freedom. But in some of these issues, the North and the South were pretty much the same. In each section, most people probably didn't care. Most people thought, oh, slavery's all right, it provides cheap labor and so forth. But in both sections, there were always a substantial number of people, probably still a minority, but there were a substantial number of people who just thought slavery was inconsistent with American ideals, with the American principle that all men are created equal. And for many of them, it was who took Christianity fairly seriously. It was also inconsistent and contradictory to the Word of God. So, but the North and the South were kind of on the same track. I mean, the efforts to get rid of slavery in the North took a long time, and northern states kind of, as I told you, they were kind of reluctant to do it, and they did so only half-heartedly, but eventually they got rid of slavery in the northern states. There were people who tried to do that in the South, and you know, they were very similar in that respect. But cotton changed that. Cotton was so important to Southern agriculture. Cotton became so important to the Southern economy that, you know, nobody could even think about getting rid of slavery. It was just an indelible part of the whole agricultural system, and thus the whole political system of the South. And as demand for slaves kept increasing, as cotton production kept increasing, as we kept moving out into the Southeast and taking more land for cotton production, the price of the demand for slaves kept increasing, the price of slaves kept going up. People were making money, not necessarily from using slaves for production, but just using slaves as an asset, having slaves be a source of their net worth, of their value. And so for many Southerners, their wealth was all in the form of slaves. The North didn't have, the South didn't have factories, the South didn't have industrialization, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes here. But so for Southerners, you know, instead of having wealth in the form of stocks and bonds and interests in factories and so forth and investments, that kind of sort of those production assets, for the South, the main source of wealth was their slaves. And this just meant that it just became harder and harder in the South to try to talk about getting rid of slavery. I mean, it would have just undermined the whole Southern economy. So, yeah, there were still people in the South who considered slavery wrong, but man, they just became fewer and fewer, and it just became harder and harder for anybody in the South to say, well, we should be getting rid of slavery, just like the North was doing. So this really changed the whole, cotton, and the demand for cotton, and the demand is coming from the textile industry, and that just really changed American history. It had a big impact on the whole history of the country. So it's kind of ironic because, as I told you, in the colonial period, we did grow cotton, not very much, and it's certainly nothing like after the invention of the cotton gin. But we did grow cotton, and as I said, people knew that it was really an ideal raw material for manufacturing clothing. Cotton clothing is very comfortable and very easy to make, and so forth. There's a lot of pluses to cotton as a textile, as a form of clothing. And so, people did grow it, but the issue was you had to pick the seeds out of the fiber, and in the early days that was a job for slaves. And Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, actually thought maybe he was going to be helping slaves, because he would be freeing them from that labor of hand picking seeds out of the fibers. And so he had hoped that by inventing the cotton gin, that the gin would replace slaves, and you wouldn't need slaves anymore, and we could move to abolish slavery. And the irony is that the cotton gin just made slavery more and more inevitable, a part of Southern life, Southern agriculture. So the cotton gin was this mechanical invention that had a tremendous impact on American history, because it worked through with the production of cotton and its manufacturing into textiles. Now, I said that the South was lagging in industrialization. And some of you may have said, wait a minute, that isn't logical. And you're right, it isn't logical. From an economic standpoint, when you have a raw material for any kind of manufacturing, if the raw material is, especially if it's very large and bulky and difficult to transport, which certainly applies to cotton. I mean, the raw cotton is a very bulky product, very heavy, very difficult to transport. The most logical thing to do is to have the factory that manufactures the product close to the raw material. So you don't have to ship the raw material to the factories. The factories are right there, and then what you ship are the finished products. You ship them throughout the whole country, and that is just a much more economical, more efficient way to go about it. So logic says that the textile mills should have been in the South, close to where it grows, and you can't grow cotton in the North. So you had to, if you're going to put factories up in the North, you have to transport the cotton up there, which is not an efficient way to go. It's much more efficient to have the factory right down there in the South. But that did not happen. And that's one of the kind of curious features of American history. Why didn't that happen? And just, well, we won't get into the History 12 class here. In the later 19th century, the textile industry moved south, which it was more logical to do anyway. But in the years that we cover in our class, the textile industry was almost totally confined in New England, which doesn't make any sense, but it's the reality. So we have to explain why. Why did the textile industry begin in New England, far away from the raw material itself? And there are a couple of answers. One is that the development of a factory requires capital. It requires money for investment. You have to have people who have liquid assets that they can invest in a factory. And New England had that. Boston had long been one of the major trading ports of the United States. Boston merchants, I've talked about them in little briefly on a couple of occasions. Boston merchants were very successful. There were a number of well-established Boston merchant families that had been around for many years and had, through their trade, through their trading activities, accumulated large fortunes of investable capital that can be invested. By contrast, in the South, most of people's wealth, even in addition to the slaves themselves, their wealth was in land. Well, land is, it's a form of wealth, but it's not anything that you can go out and invest in a factory. But New England had that, especially centered in Boston. And just as an example, there was a guy in Boston whose last name was Lowell. I can't remember his first name. It's got a weird, unmanageable first name. But Lowell and a group of other of these Boston capitalists formed an organization called the Boston Associates, which was an investment group, and they built many of the textile mills. So Boston had the edge over the South because it had access to capital. Another requirement is labor. And labor is always has been, still is today, the big obstacle for American industrialization in the modern American economy, today's economy. American industry is always at a disadvantage with the Chinese industry because China has so much cheaper labor. Well, that's today. The same thing was true in the early 19th century, except that it wasn't China, it was Britain. Britain, as I've mentioned, had this large supply of very, very poorly paid laborers. I mean, this goes back to the very beginning of the class when we were talking about England as having a large number of homeless and desperately poor, unemployable people. England has always had this surplus of labor that could be exploited, and it was exploited, but it could be exploited by paying bare survival wages, but people had no choice except to accept these low wages. So people in England flocked into the woolen mills and other industrial plants in large numbers, but with bare survival wages. Well, in the United States, it was just too easy for people to acquire land. Nobody wanted to go to work in a factory when land was relatively cheap. There was always a demand for agricultural labor, non-slave as well as slave, and so people didn't need to work in factories. So in the United States, wages were, compared to England, very high, and that was a real obstacle to industrialization. But New England had a source of labor that was not nearly as cheap as in England, but it was cheaper than in the rest of the country. And New England had the advantage of having access to at least comparatively cheap labor. And that was maybe a little bit unusual: teenage or young girls. There were many families in New England by the 18-teens, the 1820s, when this industrial revolution is getting started in America. There are many families who were living on farms that were getting smaller and smaller, and land was becoming scarcer and scarcer and harder to obtain. We started really looking at when the Puritans came to America. There was lots of land, but everything's relative. I mean, compared to the population, land was very abundant in America, and you get it very cheaply. But that was a couple hundred years before, and in that time, the population had increased a lot, but surprisingly, the amount of land had not. So land is getting more and more expensive, scarcer and scarcer, harder to get by. Farms are getting smaller and smaller. People would start out and they'd have plenty of land to give to all of their children. All of their sons could become landowners because there's plenty of land to give out, but it's been given out. And now, as the population keeps going up, farms get smaller and smaller, and life gets harder and harder. So there were a lot of small farmers in New England whose families struggled, and they could put their daughters to work in the textile mills. So these industrialists who are building these factories and starting these industrial operations they went around through rural areas recruiting young girls, and many families were willing to have their daughters go off to work in the textile mills and earn very low income, not low by English standards, but low by American standards, and contribute a little bit to the family income. So there was a source of cheap labor in New England. Now, it was hard for the manufacturers because they had to provide housing for their workforce. They had to assure the parents that their daughters would be safe if they went off to work in a factory, and so you had to have some kind of housing with security arrangements to protect these young girls against the forces of evil, i.e. teenage boys. And there was a very high turnover because girls would only work for a few years and then they'd want to get married and they'd go off, and so the manufacturers were constantly recruiting new workers to replace the departees, and you had a very high labor turnover, which meant you were constantly having to train new workers and so forth. But you just had to do it, and so they did, and they got it to work. There's another reason why New England was the center of the textile industry for many decades, and that has to do with the practical functioning of a textile mill, where you have some turning equipment, you have spinning devices, and that's what the factory does. And you need, from the standpoint of physics, you need a source of power to run that machinery. I'll mention now, get a little bit ahead of the story. By the time that we're starting this industrial revolution in the United States, it's like during the War of 1812 when we had the protection of immunity from English competition, when England couldn't export their products, and so we had this sort of gap there where we didn't have competition. And that would have been back during during the days of 1810 and so forth, around that time, just before and during the War of 1812. There was available steam engines. The steam engines had been invented. People sort of knew how to do it, but it was still in a very primitive stage. It was still very new and uncertain technology. So people were not ready to use the steam engine. Instead, they relied upon what they knew as a form of technology, which is water power. That is, you have a water mill where there's a source of a river that flows along at a certain elevation, and then it drops. There's some falls or something like that, and you can divert the water by some sort of a channel out of its natural course, run it around through a mill, have the water, instead of dropping in its natural falls, it drops across your mill, your wheel, your water wheel in the factory, and it turns the equipment. But you just can't do that anywhere. You have to find a site where there's some available water power, where you can utilize the natural resource and build your a mill right next to a waterfall and just run the water around through a wheel to turn the machinery. But you can't do that anywhere, and you have to go where the water is. You can't just build a factory out in the middle of anywhere. And there were many sites in New England which were adequate and ideal for development of water power. So the early textile mills were all located along the rivers in New England, where the rivers come out of the mountains of New England and flow down into the Atlantic. You have to build up into the country. You can't build a textile mill in Boston or in any other New England city. You have to go up into the boonies, you have to go up into the mountains and find a site, but they are there, and there you build your textile mill. But that meant that the entrepreneurs who were building these mills, the industrialists who were building these textile mills, they not only have to build the factory, but they have to build the town. They have to build residences, dormitories or whatever, for their women workers. But there are then mill towns, textile mill towns, up in the boonies. One of the most famous ones is named Lowell, which is still a modern city in the Boston metropolitan area, but it's not in the city of Boston. It's up in the hills, and it was one of the classic early mill towns in America, and it's in Massachusetts. And there's other mill towns in Massachusetts, Fall River, there's Burlington, Vermont, Manchester, New Hampshire, other textile mill towns in New England, and they're there because that's where the power is, that's where you could build a mill. So for those reasons, the textile industry developed in the North using cotton grown in the South. And that was the sort of the first breakthrough of American industrialization. Another factor that contributed to industrialization in America, and not just exclusively for the textile industry, although that was as I said, the largest and earliest and for many years the most important industry in America. Another factor that you need is transportation. You need to, if you're going to have a factory, you're going to need to be able to sell your products to a large market, preferably a national market. Preferably you want to reach to all parts of the country and sell your product over a large area. Back in the colonial days, we had manufacturing in America. It's very limited, but we had such things as lumber mills. We had grain mills that would, lumber mills would saw trees into boards and so forth, into lumber. People would take their grain to the grain mill in a town, and it would be milled into flour for cooking and so forth. But they're very small scale. They're very locally oriented. Businesses could only serve a small area, only the immediate area around where the factory was located. And so the factories are very small, and they're only producing for a small local market. And you're sort of limited to that because of transportation. You can't find a way to transport your products to a larger area. If you want to have large factories, if you want to have large output, you have to have a large market. And that means you have to have the technology to deliver your products to this larger market. And America is going to be undergoing an industrial revolution. As I said, starting basically during the War of 1812 years, we're going to have an industrial revolution. But sort of part of that, and before we can really have an industrial revolution, we have to have a transportation revolution. Well, there were developments in transportation that made larger scale industrialization possible. You know, in the early days, in the colonial days, transportation was as I said, it's mostly by sea. You know, if you ship anything from one part of America to another, the main way to do it is to get it to the port and put it on a boat and ship it somewhere, whether it be to another American port or some foreign port. Internally, there's almost no roads. There were places where roads had sort of developed and people would ride horses, or they would ride horse-drawn carriages. But all it is just a place where the natural environment is just kind of worn down and beaten down a little bit. And it's not at all adequate, and it's not reliable at all. You know, it closes in the wintertime, and it closes every time it rains or whatever. So it's very, very inadequate. But starting around the 1790s, people started building official, formal roads. So we're going to talk here about step by step the development of transportation. Sort of the first step was the building of roads. And there were a couple of different technologies that people developed. Frankly, neither of them worked very well at all. One was called macadam, and it's sort of like a gravel, or but it's an actual road. You build a road. You don't just sort of have a place where horses normally go. It's an actual road, and it's an official road that is accessible by paying a toll. You have to pay a fee for the use of the road, and it's kind of like a gravel or a rock road, but it's laid out, and it's graded, and it's surveyed and so forth. The other was called a plank road, and they'd use planks from trees and make it into a road. Both of them were very inadequate. And frankly, they didn't work very well, and they weren't all that serviceable, but they did exist, and that was sort of the first step in the development of transportation. That starts around the 1790s. There were a lot of roads built in the 1790s and on until the early 19th century. But the next step was a breakthrough by the state of New York, which in 1816 started building the Erie Canal. And the state built a canal that ran across New York State from Albany, which is on the Hudson River, and you could go by a sailboat up the Hudson River, at least as far as Albany. And I think I mentioned that the United States was blessed to have many rivers in our interior that could accommodate sailing boats well into the interior, and you could sail all the way from New York up to Albany. I don't know, that's like 60, 70 miles or something. And then at Albany, the state of New York started building a canal that cut across the state, and it went over to near Buffalo on Lake Erie. And that was completed. The Erie Canal was completed in 1825. It was very controversial. There were a lot of people in New York who complained about it. They're spending all this money building this canal. And it was built by the state of New York. It cost a lot of money, but in fact it was an enormous success, hugely successful. Just a tremendous amount of traffic moving on that canal, opening up vast areas of the interior of New York to settlement. The whole mid-New York area just had a population explosion of people moving in now that there was access by transportation. And you could transport your goods down the canal to your farm goods down the canal to Albany, and then from Albany down to New York City. So you could export your products. So there's a flow of agricultural products out of the Erie Canal and down to New York City, and then a flow of imports and locally manufactured goods up the river and out to the interior throughout the whole upstate area of New York. And then from the connection at Buffalo through the whole Great Lakes region, you could go throughout the entire region there. And this meant that you could now open up and develop that region. And so there are a number of cities built in the Great Lakes, starting with Buffalo, and then you go out to Cleveland, to Detroit, and eventually by the 1830s to Chicago, the greatest of them all. So there's this whole establishment of development and agriculture and possibilities for manufacturing throughout the Great Lakes because of the Erie Canal. And this meant that the whole need to use the rivers to go down to New Orleans is now not required. There still was a lot of traffic on the rivers, and the whole Ohio Valley and the Mississippi was still very, very important to American agriculture and to American economic development. But in addition to that, we now had the whole Great Lakes region, sort of a northern tier that could also develop. So the United States in the 1820s, the 1830s, with the opening of the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes, just had an economic boom, a tremendous time of great prosperity and expansion and growth made possible by the Erie Canal. So this was a very successful development in American history. The state of New York ended up making an enormous amount of money from the traffic on the Erie Canal, and it was a great success for the state of New York. A lot of opposition to it, but the opponents were totally wrong, and the canal was a very successful thing. Eventually, many other states started building canals. There was a whole canal mania in the aftermath of the success of the Erie Canal. No other canal approached the success of the Erie Canal. There was none of the many canals that were built by many other states anywhere approached the Erie Canal for success. And in fact, many of them were built just to be building a canal, and frankly, they weren't very practical. They were not well designed. They were the geography wasn't right, and in fact, many of them were money losers. The state of Ohio built a lot of canals, but went bankrupt because they built so many canals and none of them paid off. The state of Illinois built a big canal connecting Lake Michigan to the Illinois River, which would connect to the Mississippi. And so it was an effort to sort of combine these two agricultural areas, the Great Lakes in the northern region, the Ohio Valley sort of across the southern section. And the idea was to build a canal connecting them, but it was a failure, and Illinois as a state also had to declare bankruptcy because they lost so much money on what they called the Illinois-Michigan Canal. But there's a whole transportation explosion there, and that permitted an industrial explosion, a lot of expansion and growth and prosperity and so forth. Um, the rivers, though, were still important, and the river cities such as Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Louisville and St. Louis, they had a chance to sort of remain competitive because of the invention around 1810 of a steam engine on a boat. People figured out, it took a little while, as I said, steam engine technology was just starting and it was still very primitive and it didn't always work. And there were a lot of problems with it, but by the 1820s, people were getting good enough with steam engines that they could use them on boats. So there was a great deal of steamboat traffic on the Ohio River and then connecting to the Mississippi River. St. Louis became a great center of the river trade. There's a rivalry between St. Louis and Chicago. Chicago was the great lake city, using the lakes, which eventually ended up on the Erie Canal. St. Louis was using the rivers, the river network of the Ohio River, the Missouri River, and the Mississippi River, which all converged around St. Louis. And so the port of New Orleans was still very important. It was a major center, even though the Erie Canal, of course, is putting all of its produce, dumping it out into New York. And New York, of course, which had always been a major city, became by far the largest city, bigger than any other city in the country, bigger than a couple other cities combined. So this period of the 1820s and the 1830s is a time of great industrial growth, fueled by these transportation innovations. And some of you may be thinking about going ahead a little bit, thinking about the railroad, which is going to be the ultimate and by far the best of the transportation innovations. It's a little bit later. It's a little bit, we'll get back to it, but as of the 1820s, 1830s, the technology of railroads was not quite yet there. But by the 1840s and 1850s, we're not quite that far in the course yet, but by the 1840s and 1850s, the railroad is going to supersede all other forms of transportation. Well, this whole movement is very important in American history. It's the transportation changes, the innovations, the new technology, new cities that are developing, cities that hadn't even existed before are becoming major cities. Like Rochester, New York, which is right in sort of in the middle of the Erie Canal, didn't exist in 1810. By 1830, it's one of the 10 largest cities in the country, and there are other just boom cities out there that are areas that are just having fantastic economic growth and industrial expansion. This is a very dramatic and very dynamic period in American history. Now, I talked a little bit about these transportation innovations. There's a question about who should carry that on. And there were basically three answers, and I've sort of given you a couple of them already. One answer was to have it be done by a private investor, a private corporation would build it. Most roads were built by private corporations. That's one option, the private sector. And as I said, most of those roads were failures, but they were built by private investors trying to make a profit. But they didn't work very well, so there wasn't that much traffic on them, and they would charge a toll for their use. That's how the developers expected to make money, but very few of them were successful, so it was not a very successful innovation. It was not a very successful business. There were some roads built by, the two other options were by the government. One option is the private sector, and then there's the public sector, the government. And within that, there's two options. There's either the state or the federal government. So those are the three: private, state, or federal. And there were states that built some roads, and the federal government built what was called the National Road that started just outside of Washington, over in some little town in Maryland, just outside of the city, and went over and eventually went all the way out to, eventually it went all the way to somewhere in Illinois, a road that was built by the federal government, the National Road. But most roads were private, and they were not very successful, and eventually the roads were just sort of overwhelmed by the great success of the canals and then steamboats on the rivers. But the state is another option, and that option was what was the Erie Canal. Erie Canal was built by the state of New York, and that was a great success, as I told you. And then all of those other canals that were built, most of them were built by states, and many of them were failures, which did not give the whole idea of state investment a very good look, but that was an option, the state government. And the third option was the federal government. And the federal government, as I said, it built a road, it built the National Road. It was also an investor in a couple of canals. There's a canal, I forgot what it's called, but it starts in Washington, or just outside of Washington, D.C., and goes over through and goes out to somewhere in Pennsylvania. It doesn't go to a major city, but there was a canal there that was built by the federal government was a partner in it with the state of New York and the state of Pennsylvania. So all three of those options were used. There were transportation innovations using all three of those options. But the idea of federal improvement was appealing to a politician that I've mentioned to you earlier, and that was Henry Clay. Henry Clay was sort of the epitome of what I've talked about as sort of the new breed of Republicans. The Republicans who were not in the same old mode of Jefferson, not in the classic mode, which had ideas of states' rights and maintaining the United States as an agrarian nation. This new breed, of which Clay is probably the best known individual, he's advocating a much more active federal government and a much greater role by the federal government in promoting economic growth, just like Alexander Hamilton. Clay, of course, considered himself a Republican, as everybody did. I mean, that's all there was. So he considers himself a Republican, but he's not the same as the old-fashioned Jeffersonian Republicans. Henry Clay developed a program that he called the American System, the American System. And it had three components, all of which I've talked about, but maybe not quite in this context. One of the components was the Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States, which was chartered by Congress in 1816, after the war and as part of this whole sort of Republican reevaluation of their position, and they're now coming out more in favor of what we historically had been sort of the ideas of Hamilton. Now they're being adopted by Clay and the new Republicans. So the Bank of the United States was one of the big components of the American system. The other was high tariffs. I mentioned that in 1816, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816, to protect the infant American industries against British competition. And we'd had a tariff since 1789, but tariff rates had historically been low enough that they afforded little or no protection against English cheap labor. But the tariff starting in 1816 is now much larger, it's a much higher tariff, and it's designed not just to provide revenue, although it did that, it was a major source of revenue for the federal government, but it also meant that the price of British goods would be much higher because that British manufacturers would have to pay the tariff, and that would make American manufacturing more competitive. It's there to enable Americans to compete against English goods by raising the price of English goods and to offset the great advantage that England had because of its cheap labor. And so high tariffs was an integral part of Clay's American system. And the third was the construction of internal improvements by the federal government. So he's advocating everybody's in favor of building these, what were called internal improvements, these transportation methods. But what Clay is advocating as part of his whole program is that it be done by the federal government. So he's got a plan here where he's saying that the way we're going to help America, and we're going to help American farmers along with everybody else, because we're going to have a sound monetary system because of the bank. We're going to protect American manufacturers, but protecting American manufacturers is going to help American agriculture because the manufacturers are going to need the raw materials produced by American agriculture. And classic example, of course, the key example would be the textile industry and the demand for cotton and how that helps American cotton farmers. But it also helps other American farmers because we're going to have these big factory towns. We're going to have all of these laborers working in towns, and they're going to need food. So that's going to help other American farmers who are going to be supplying food to the laborers in the cities. And then making it all work will be a transportation network so that we can transport raw materials from the farms to the factories. We can transport manufactured goods from the factories to the communities and throughout the country. And all of this is going to be a time of great economic growth and prosperity. And as I said, it worked. The United States in the 1920s just had a boom. The bank did a good job of controlling the money supply. Monetary policy is always a little bit dicey because on the one hand, you want to have banks able to issue enough paper money so the economy can grow. People need to be able to borrow money at lower interest rates so that they can expand, they can build new factories. So you want a kind of an open system that allows money to circulate, allows banks to issue a lot of paper money. But you don't want to go too far, because if you go too far, then the banks will issue too much paper money, and then eventually people are going to figure out there's not enough gold there, there's just too much paper money, and so then the whole system will collapse and the banks will all fail, and then you'll have a disaster. So you've got to hit a happy medium there. You want to issue a good amount of money, but not too much. And during the 1820s, the bank's president was a guy named Nicholas Biddle. And basically Biddle did a pretty good job of sort of hitting that middle ground of allowing growth, but not too much. So the economy was expanding and growing. And so we had a good money supply. Tariffs protected manufacturing. And we built a number of internal improvements at federal expense. A lot of that involved just improving rivers and harbors. The Army Corps of Engineers was established to keep our rivers dredged, to permit river traffic, kept our harbors dredged and drained so that ships could come in, and that was done by the federal government. And so we've got an activist federal government. And so this is like the Hamiltonian concept of an active federal government. And its great advocate now is Henry Clay. And so he's a big part of the whole economic growth and a great advocate of it. This is American system. And so he's a great national leader. As I said, politically, by the 1820s, we only have one party. We're down to the Republican Party. James Monroe had, I told you, been re-elected unanimously in 1820. So now we're getting ready for the election of 1824. And Henry Clay is one of the key candidates. He's as sort of you could call him kind of the architect of the Great Prosperity with his American system. He's very popular, and he's a very strong candidate for the potential for the Republican Party. So the party, there's only the one party, but what's happened is that the party has, instead of having rivalry between the Republicans and the Federalists, as we'd had since the 1790s, now there are many rivalries within but all within the Republican Party. There are several candidates for president in 1824, and they're all Republicans. So it's within the Republican Party. And the Republican Party has to decide which of these candidates is going to be the official party candidate for president, because essentially there's going to be nobody else. There's no Federalist Party along anymore, so the party has to decide who they're going to nominate for president. And we'll pick that up in our next lecture. The election of 1824 will be our starting point. And your question for today is, what were the three components of Henry Clay's American system?